Hello everyone, my name is Priya and I will be talking about literary theory and literary criticism. I plan to have a series of lectures from Aristotle onto contemporary theories. So this is the first module. Welcome to Aristotle right up to Neoclassicism. So initially I would like to make a distinction between the terms literary criticism and literary theory. Now this is a question often addressed by the students. Well, before that, let me tell you, students of literature often have a great problem when they approach theory. They feel that theory takes away the beauty of literature and come up with questions like, we have been enjoying the writings of romantics like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Philip Larkin in the later stage. Why do we have to spoil it by learning something so abstruse as literary theory? The answer is, literary theory gives you a framework within which you analyze a text. The text can be a novel, it can be a poem, it can be a piece of art like a painting or a movie. Anything like a product of art can be classified as a text, and literary theory actually gives you the intellectual framework within which you can analyze a specific text. So let us first talk about literary criticism and literary theory. If you look at it probably right up to Neoclassicism, you have the word criticism being used. And after that, with formalism onwards, you find the term shifting from criticism to theory. Well, if you look at the John Hopkins book of literary theory and criticism, they make it a point to tell you that they don't distinguish between these two terms. But for the sake of convenience, let us mark literary criticism as the study, evaluation, and interpretation of literature, and literary theory, which is actually a philosophical discussion of the methods and goals of literary criticism, by which I mean to say the literary theory is the philosophy and literary criticism can then be considered as the practical application of these frames of analysis. Alright, so there's another school of critics who think that literary criticism is a practical application of literary theory because criticism deals with particular literary works, whereas theory is more general or abstract. Theory depends, most of the theorists we know are philosophers, and these philosophical theories are used as frameworks to understand literary texts. So criticism then, you can again qualify and tell them that criticism is fundamentally the estimation of a particular work or a body of work, the insights and the impact of the text, and the aesthetic in production or performance of the text. So all these things are interrelated. And please remember that literature deals with everything. And therefore, theory is also, by its very nature, multidisciplinary. You have the field of anthropology, the discipline of anthropology, you have linguistics, you have physics coming in, you have statistics coming in. All these things together combine to give you an idea of what theory is. And all these contribute greatly to the understanding of development, I would say, of literary theory. And in the past 3 or 4 decades, literary theory has come to play a very central role in the academic study of humanities and social sciences. Sometimes you feel that these theories are contradicting each other. Sometimes they complement each other. They are coming from diverse ideas, the diverse disciplines, and some of these theories come to combat one which was in existence earlier. Or sometimes it is a mere continuation or taking it to the fullest possible extent of the previous age, the theory which developed in the previous age. So we find that sometimes they are competing, sometimes even incompatible approaches. So literary theory, again, when you begin with the idea of theory, I would take away the idea of literature from it, just theory. Theory doesn't just deal with literature. Theory can deal with anthropology, theory can deal with the discipline of science, theory can deal with any other discipline, just not literature. But what is said about anthropology, what is said about culture can easily be adapted and used to get a framework within which we attempt to understand a particular text. Now, criticism still embraces what is called exegesis, that is interpretation and evaluation, but without the help of the framework, any sort of interpretation would be extraordinarily subjective, extremely subjective, I should say. And when you become subjective, personal prejudice and bias starts to creep in, which makes it a value-based judgment, and you don't get an interpretation of the text as such. So this is why students of literature ought to learn theory, because it gives you a framework. And to give you a very, very simple example, what is the difference from the way you, a student of literature, would look at a flower and a student of botany would look at a flower? The student of botany probably knows more about the scientific name, the season in which a particular flower blooms, where it would bloom, what is the lifespan of this flower. All these things are given to them by the discipline in which they study. In much the same way, a student of zoology or botany can just look at a poem and appreciate it for its beauty. They might not see the underlying political strategy within the text. Now that is up to us to discover, and the idea of literary theory provides us with the necessary technique, the necessary tools of analysis through which you attempt to understand the text. Therefore, when we try to read a text, we just don't bring in our personal beliefs or personal predilections and just tell them a text is good or bad based on your personal preferences. We give them exactly what a text is trying to say. It is a performance that we conduct upon a particular text. Now, having established, I hope, the difference between literary criticism and literary theory, let us go on to Aristotle, or perhaps Plato before Aristotle, because Aristotle's concept of art is a direct answer to his teacher, Plato, because, I presume that most of you would be knowing Aristotle and Plato, and the questions posed by Plato and the value-based judgments that he made on art are very often questioned by Aristotle. So Plato was concerned about politics. Plato was concerned about order. Plato was concerned about maintaining decorum in a society. And therefore, he viewed the artist with a lot of suspicion. If you remember, the artist was considered to be a man who was inspired, a divinely inspired man. Mark the note point, he thought differently. Therefore, in a perfectly ordered society, and order means where people think alike, people perform alike, and uniformity is the norm, a person who would think differently might have posed a problem. So he becomes the force of anarchy within this set of disciplined bodies. And therefore, Plato looked at the artist, particularly the poet, with a lot of suspicion. He called them liars. And he says that, I don't want them in his hypothetical republic. He doesn't want them in his idealist republic. So Aristotle was a disciple of Plato. And please remember that Aristotle did not sit and write down all these things. They come to us in the form of the talks put together, right? And Aristotle was Plato's disciple. Another dubious distinction given to Aristotle is that he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. Now, personally, I've often pondered about the context of calling Alexander as the Great. What was so great about Alexander? What was so great about a man who unleashed violence upon unsuspecting civil bodies? That's a question for deliberation which we can take up later in the course of these discussions. So, to place Aristotle, Plato's view of literature was conditioned by political concern which pervaded Athens at that point of time. Now, how to maintain discipline, how to control the civil body. Aristotle belongs to a later age, and his views of literature are not political in that sense, and therefore his critical approach is intrinsic to the nature of art. So Aristotle's work on the theory of literature is the treatise called Poetics, right? And please remember, when we get to read the Poetics, it is the translated version that we read, and therefore many of the terms that Aristotle used have been subject to multiple interpretations. And we just deal with uncertainties there. We do not know exactly what he said or what he meant. What we get are filtered on versions, handed over by generations of scholars who have resorted to translations and interpretations in their own unique manner. Now, Aristotle's theory of literature can be considered as an answer to Plato, but of course he does develop his idea of art a lot further. For Aristotle, as for Plato, the theory of literature is only a part of the wider idea of reality. This means that if you really want to understand poetics, we must take into consideration the Aristotelian theory, which is defined by metaphysics, ethics, the texts like politics and rhetoric. Plato's theory of literature is said to rest on the metaphysical basis of his theory of ideas, the doctrine of ideas, where art is thrice removed from reality. The idea of the bed and the artistic representation of bed, so you get a far inferior picture. Now, Aristotle reacts against this in all areas of knowledge. Aristotle doesn't believe that the world of appearances, that is the world created by art, is ephemeral, it's a copy of changeless ideas. Rather, he believes that the essence of things is in the thing themselves. And change doesn't say something is false. Change just implies that there is a vitality within it. And there is a change, a passage from potential to the action itself. So change, again, if you look at nature, it's a fundamental process of nature as well. So Aristotle's main contribution to criticism can be that the poem or poetry is an art with an object of its own, and it can be understood and reduced to an intelligible set of rules. The main concern of the rules is not with the composition of the literary work, or how it should be written, rather it is a critical evaluation. So criticism, then we understand, is a sort of a science. It is not random ideas or intuitions or based on just a flight of imagination. It is a very strongly set of codes. So poetry finds a place, definitely poetry is important in Aristotle's general scheme of human activity. He divides human activity into three areas: thought, action and production. Thought, action and production. Poetry and the arts he includes under the head of imitation or mimesis, the art of imitating, which is again one part of production. So we have a clear distinction here. The artist does not merely imitate, it is through imitation, but that imitation is also a sort of production, not just unthinking reproduction, but a part of creativity goes into it. So we might say that Aristotle sets literature free from Plato's notions of moralism and didacticism, but he still expects poetry to be conformable with the moral understanding of the world. So the distinction is that Plato wanted, if you have to be a teacher, you have to teach them moral values. If poetry doesn't teach moral values, poetry is based on falsehood, banish the poets. Aristotle doesn't say this. He says that there is a moral dimension to writing, but you have to judge poetry by its own rules. And this is what Aristotle does with teaching as well. To pleasure, he doesn't accept the idea of pleasure at face value. He makes an organic combination of the two theories, the theory of teaching and the theory of pleasure. So pleasure in literature is not hedonistic satisfaction. That is important, because Aristotle, all said and done, again gave a lot of importance to the idea of what is right and wrong, which was very clearly in vogue then, the idea of right and wrong, as it was in his period. The result, he was talking about an underlying intellectual activity or experience. So the idea of pleasure is not hedonistic, rather it is intellectual. For him, literature is rational and beneficial. It is not dangerous, it is not irrational like Plato had thought it to be. So Aristotle explains how the different poetical genres have developed to the highest point in the discipline of poetry which is tragedy. So for Aristotle, tragedy is the highest form of creativity to which a poet can aspire to. Now, poetry again, he divides into two channels depending on the individual temperament of the writer. So the most serious type of writer would move into tragedy, and people who wrote about the trivial actions of the ordinary people, they would move into the area of comedy. Again, there has been a lot of questions regarding Aristotle's use of noble. There are writers in later ages who have felt that the word noble actually referred to your accident of birth. If you're a royal person or you belong to the higher classes of society, Aristotle actually meant by character the choices that you make, and it is the choices that you make you a noble person or not. Now that has been another explanation given to Aristotelian notion of a noble character, or a person, a writer trying to imitate the noble features of noblemen, which is tragedy. Now, Aristotle begins with a brief outline of the history of tragedy from the Dithyramb through the work of Exegesis to Sophocles and Euripides. So Exegesis, increased the number of actors from 1 to 2, reduced the time the chorus was given, and gave the first place to dialogue. Now, Sophocles introduced more than 2 actors, and then painted scenery was also introduced. So he deals with the trajectory of tragedy, how it develops during his age. And coming back to this concept of poetry, the beginning of which we spoke about, poetry has sprung from 2 causes lying deep within the psyche of man. The first, you can say, is the instinct for imitation. How a child learns to talk, how a child learns to behave in society, it is through imitation. So the instinct for imitation is very strongly present within the human psyche. Secondly, this instinct to go after harmony and rhythm, something which gives you a lot of pleasure. So the instinct of imitation, you develop it a bit further, it is common to all processes of learning. That is how you learn. Imitation and recognition of imitations give you a sort of pleasure. So we have evidence of this in the facts of experience. Now, the example that is given is that objects which in themselves we view with pain, we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity. For example, painful things, painful incidents, but when it is recreated in the form of a poem or a theatrical performance, we find delight in it. But that's a question we have to ask ourselves. Students often ask me, why do we go for movies which make you cry? You must have heard your friends say, that is a really good movie. I cry throughout the movie. In normal life, in your real life, you wouldn't want to cry. Here you pay money and you go and watch a movie which is promising you that you will cry. Right? So this idea of what gives us pleasure, why does pain or the depiction of pain give us pleasure? This perhaps may be the answer. That if you produce something which is real and produce it in the form of a product of an art form, sometimes it is reproduced in such a way that what it gives is no longer pain but pleasure. Pleasure from this idea of seeing an imitation, pleasure in the idea of seeing harmony. And the intellectual value of poetry. Now that is another question which troubles Plato, and a question which Aristotle tries to answer. He tries to draw a distinction between poetry and philosophy and poetry and history. And we will focus on the distinction between poetry and history. History tells you, Aristotle says, about things which have actually happened. Poetry also tells you about things which have happened, but also things which may happen. Which means poetry is more universal in nature. History deals with fixities and certainties and things which have come to pass. Poetry is more general, and poetry goes beyond the fact or factual truth. The difference, I would quote, the poet and the historian differ not by writing in verse and prose. The true difference is that one relates, that is the historian relates, what has happened, and poetry or the poet talks about what may happen. Therefore, Aristotle says, poetry is more philosophical and a higher thing than history. because poetry expresses the universal, history only talks about the particular. I hope that point is clear. That there's a clear argument against his teacher. Why should you not banish the poet from the ideal republic? Because poetry is philosophy, and if you feel that the historian is valid, then the poet is also valid, because the poet contributes a different type of truth to society. Alright, and next is the rules. Poetry is not subject to the rules of normal speech. It is a discipline in itself, and it establishes its own rules. Each genre of poetry has its own sets of rules. Well, you have the rules of rhythm, you have the rules of cadences of words. So each genre sends to set up a set of rules for itself. And that is Aristotle's idea of poetry. I will not be going in great detail into Aristotle because I have a limited amount of time. But one thing, one idea or concept which I would like to touch upon is catharsis. This has again been greatly deliberated by scholars of Aristotle. What is catharsis? The purgation of pity and fear. You watch a play, you watch a tragedy on stage, and you have a hero. And the hero is a good person. The hero is somebody we can identify ourselves with. The reason why you're able to identify with the hero is because he is not all good. There are problems within his character. And it is these problems which push him into a situation out of which he emerges defeated. Right? So if you show a person who's entirely good, falling from virtue to unhappiness or sorrow, it might be a bit difficult to create. But if you show a person who has some flaw, a tragic flaw, placed in a particular centuries, the very thing that he relies as demand of his idea of the tragic flaw can be easily explained. Choices. Let us take two situations of Shakespeare. Let's take Othello and let's take Hamlet. Now, Hamlet's problem, we have often mentioned, is procrastination. He keeps putting off. The murder of his uncle is kept on delayed. He says, oh, he's at prayer now. Let me catch the conscience of Claudius. Let me try to see if he's really guilty or not. And he keeps putting it off. Right? Othello doesn't put anything off. He just believes what is told. And he doesn't see any reason not to suspect his beloved wife. And he jumps to conclusions and does what he thinks he has to do. Supposing you put Othello in Hamlet's place and Hamlet in Othello's place, tragedy would have been averted. If you put Othello in Hamlet's place, Act 1, Scene 1, the ghost tells him, look, I have been murdered. This is the man who's murdered me. And now look, he's married your mother. Very next scene, Othello would go up to the uncle, kill him, become the king, and there ends the play. Act 1, Scene 2, perhaps the play would end. And put Hamlet in Othello's place. Hamlet would go on deliberating whether his wife has cheated him, whether she's unfaithful, whether he can trust her. Probably he'll go on till he's 60 years old. And the play would never end perhaps, or the play would never even begin because there wouldn't be a climax, there wouldn't be a catastrophe. So this is in essence the tragic flaw. Now, seeing a person suffer like this, what the dramatist hopes to achieve is the proper purgation of pity and fear. So pity and fear, how does the theatre, the person, the director, the artist create pity and fear? Pity and fear are made possible, it is said, through imitation of what is. Members of an audience can experience such powerful emotions only because the play imitates what is possible. It can happen, the fear that what has happened to this man on screen, on stage, can happen to me, arouses pity and fear. But there are critics who say that the theatre is not a hospital. The theatre is not a place where you go to in order to purge yourself of these unwanted emotions. So this is where Aristotle's moral crisis creeps in, where the didacticism which you can't leave also creeps in. So that is the entire notion of catharsis. So this talk is just a pointer where you can go to these ideas, the idea of a plot, a well-structured plot, what Aristotle thought of as a plot. What is Aristotle's notion of a character? What Aristotle thinks about catharsis? All these things have to be further investigated. These are just pointers. So from Aristotle, we would have to go on to Longinus. Longinus, Cassius Longinus as he's called. his identity again is highly debated. With Longinus, I think we move into the framework of a reader response. What is the effect of a text on a reader? And on the sublime talks about the intensity, the nature and occurrences of a certain kind of writing. And Longinus gives you the idea of the sublime, to be lifted out of yourself, to experience something that is too beautiful to be talking, it's too beautiful for words perhaps. But how? That is the irony here. On the sublime, how do you achieve this concept? How do you achieve this state of mind? Through the use of deliberately chosen words, exact words. He gives you a 5-point formula to actually put forward this concept of sublimity. So it is the grandeur of thought, and that is the first essential source of the sublime. Lofty, natural expression is possible only when there are lofty thoughts. Elevating thoughts remain as the echo of a great soul. So once again, the author is extremely important. The liberal humanist idea of the author rather, that the author is capable of forming these lofty emotions, lofty ideas. And the second source of the sublime is genuine emotion. The emotion which is conveyed is not something which is artificial, which is not real, but it is genuine. It should be strong, it should be natural, and it should be put forward in language which he calls lofty and elevated. And what will it do? It will move the readers. It will give them pleasure. So it should, first you have the subject, the thought rather, and the style. The next is the use of figures of speech, the techniques of writing. The formation and use of figures of speech boost the expression only if they are properly used. Again, he is very, very careful as to make a distinction between the mechanical use, the forced use of the figures of speech, and something which comes naturally, which flows, you should say, from the loftiness of the thought. Right, so that is the area of rhetorics. We are moving on into the question of rhetorics. And the fourth source of the sublime is diction. Diction is the proper choice and arrangement of words. Longinus says that you have to use proper, striking words to enthrall the hearers. So we, coming to the understanding that words are extremely powerful. Words can create emotions. And words should be noble. Again, the idea of nobility, which corresponds to subject matter and emotions. And then you have dignified and elevated composition. The last source of the sublime is the dignified and elevated arrangement of diction. But diction has to be so structured that the grandeur of the composition will be reflected clearly. So these are the 5 ideas of the sublime. So from Aristotle, we move on into Longinus, and Longinus tells you what he thinks is proper to be done by a writer, so that the writer is able to convey this feeling of sublimity into the minds of the reader. Now, there are other writers as well, but we will not be going into them at this point of time. I would just like to come to the neoclassical writers in England, because when we learn literature, we are basically talking about British literature for a long time, right? And yeah, so Neoclassicism. The Neoclassics, I'm just putting it together because they believed that the classics were the greatest, and they had great respect for classical writers, that is, writers of ancient Greece and Rome. And what was the basic idea pushed forward by the neoclassical writers? Strong traditionalism, conventions, rules, they loved that. And they distrusted innovation. Please remember that. Rules are the best. Everything which has been said by the classics are beautiful, the best. Subscribe to them. Follow them everywhere. And don't think of bringing in any new thoughts or new ideas. So it was a truly international European aesthetic movement. It swept across Europe, definitely talking. We just focus on England here. And actually, Neoclassicism didn't just talk about literature. It spoke about all sorts of visual culture. Whether it is painting, whether it is sculpture, they had something to say about it all. Now, despite its practical and theoretical connections with classical tradition of Western art, Neoclassicism was perceived by the 18th century as a revolutionary rejection of the decadence, the Baroque, that had held its way since the early 17th century. So when we look at it from this distance, we feel that it's an unbroken line of thought, the classics and the neoclassics. But between them, you had something else, radical innovations, the Baroque art. And the neoclassics saw themselves as very new because they were rejecting a process of thought or a style of thought or a style of creation which was in vogue at that point of time. Now, seeking to reform the society, neoclassicists enlisted ancient virtue, morality and ethics as antidotes to what they thought was the frivolity and the licentiousness of the 18th century elites. So they were also responding to a particular mode of thought which dominated the 18th century, and they wanted that licentiousness to be removed. Now, the last, it was actually utopian. You're trying to create again an ideal society where people behave in a manner which is proper behavior, right? And they were trying to offer up in Asia to an ailing Europe for ills such as superstition, social inequality, and all these things. Now, for the sake of convenience, you can divide the neoclassical period into three coherent parts. The Restoration Age first, where you have Milton, Bunyan and Dryden, the dominant influences. The Augustan Age. Pope was the central figure. And you had Defoe and Richardson playing around with a novel. And then you have the age of Dr. Johnson, one of the person who was sort of presiding over the neoclassical age. And this entire age, it was said, was dominated and characterized by the mind and personality of Dr. Johnson, whose sympathies were always with a fading Augustan past. Great faith in that age, and he hoped to recreate it. But again, when you think of Johnson as a strict neoclassical writer, you must also remember that Johnson revitalized the reading of Shakespeare. And he started telling the scholars of Shakespeare why they should admire him more. And this period also saw the emergence of the Gothic school. So that's a problem with this strict division of a particular age or a particular idea into different ages. They overlap. Okay? So, literature for the neoclassics is an art. Here, when I use the term art, it is something which can be learned. It is something which can be perfected through practice. So, art is a set of skills. You need talent, but definitely you can perfect it by long hours of study and practice. And what you should do is, you have to adapt known and tested means. What oft was thought, but never so well expressed. So thought was always there. You try to perfect the style in which it is reproduced. So human beings were regarded as the primary subject matter of literature. Poetry, here, it is an imitation of human life, a mirror held up to nature. And here, nature means not the nature that we see around you, but human nature. So here we find the beginnings of Romanticism, the exact opposite, right? So this is the idea that the Romantics were rebelling against. Alright, so poetry is designed to yield instruction and aesthetic pleasure. Instruction as well as pleasure. What sort of pleasure? Again, not hedonistic pleasure, aesthetic pleasure. So not art for art's sake at all, but art for humanity's sake, to uplift them, to make them better, to enlighten them. So emphasis was placed on what human beings possess in common, not the strange person, not the other, but the uniform, the people, what was thought natural, what was thought the mainstream. Characteristics widely shared, thoughts, feelings and tastes. So nothing out of the ordinary, but talk about the majority, talk about what most people wanted, and their idea about what most people wanted again is definitely slanted. So like Pope said, what oft was thought, but never so well expressed. So the idea is the perfection in style. Now, They were also, like I said, reacting against the Renaissance. A Renaissance which had great emphasis on imagination, invention, experimentation, mysticism. Here you have common sense, restraint, philosophical conservatism. They maintain that, right? So this is what they are reacting against. The exaggerated emphasis given to imagination in the preceding age is something they want to do away with. And they want to talk about human nature, very, very staid and stable sort of human being. The man himself, human being himself, was the most appropriate subject of art. Follow nature everywhere. And art is valuable because it's somehow useful. Art helps you to achieve some ends. And the favorite literary forms, the neoclassics, preferred essay, the letter, the satire, the parody, and the moral fable. There is a common denominator here, didactic in its extreme. And the favorite version of poetry was a rhymed couplet. And you find that Pope has actually mastered the art of writing heroic couplets, a sophistication of Pope's heroic couplets. And theatre, in the meantime, you see heroic drama, sentimental comedy, or these sort of things. So, to say, from Aristotle, move on to Longinus, and then when you come to neoclassics, we feel that they're following the same trajectory of thought. But we understand that the neoclassics saw themselves as reacting to a particular strain of thought which was there in existence in Europe at that point of time. And they were reacting against it by insisting on decorum, by insisting that the man of letters follow painstakingly the masters, the classical writers who had written in a different age, and don't try for anything new, don't try for anything radical, rather stick to what has already been done, but make it better by long hours of practice. So please focus on the word art here. Art, something which can be learned, something which can be perfected through practice, not something which is divinely inspired, not something a product of divinely inspired minds. That is a basic distinction that you want to make here. So we will continue with Romanticism in the next module. My email will be given to you at some part of the screen. I would like you to respond. Thank you very much.